Our senses help us to take in the world around us by converting stimuli, or sensory information, into electrical signals that are processed by the brain. In fact, we're constantly bombarded by stimuli even though we're only aware of what our own senses can pick up. We define the absolute threshold of a sensation as the minimum stimulation needed to register a particular stimulus 50% of the time. If I play a series of tiny beeps at different decibels or levels of loudness, randomly but repeatedly over a period of time, and you tell me that you hear one of those beeps 50% of the times it was presented, that would be the loudness considered to be your absolute threshold. Examples of absolute threshold that you'll find in almost any textbook include our ability to see a candle from 30 miles on a dark, clear night, or to hear the tick of a watch at 20 feet under quiet conditions, to taste 1 teaspoon of sugar in 2 gallons of water, to smell 1 drop of perfume diffused into a 3-room apartment, or to feel the wing of a fly falling on your cheek from a distance of half an inch. But picking up weak sensory signals isn't only about the strength of the stimulus, it's also about your psychological state, your alertness, and expectations in the moment. This is the basis of the signal detection theory, a model for predicting how and when a person will detect a weak stimulus, partly based on context. For example, when you walk to your car that is parked in an empty parking lot late at night, all by yourself, you might be much more aware of the noises around you, because the situation is somewhat threatening. You are primed and listening carefully to hear anything and everything. In this case, you might hear some slight noises that you might otherwise not hear if you were in a different situation that was not as threatening. On the other hand, if you've ever been expecting an important call that you didn't want to miss, you probably had the experience where you think you hear your phone ringing or feel it vibrating in your pocket, and then you realize no one was calling. So, it's important to remember that our ability to detect signals or noises by any of our 5 senses is almost always affected by factors unrelated to the intensity of the stimuli itself. I might go out at night and look up at the sky, and while I know that no 2 stars could have exactly the same brightness, some may still seem to look exactly alike. That is, I know there must be a difference, but I just can't detect the difference in their brightness. The point at which one can tell the difference is known as the difference threshold, but it's not linear. Instead, if that tiny point of light was just a little bit brighter than another tiny point of light, I would be more likely to detect the difference than if a larger light was brighter in exactly the same small amount. This is known as Weber's law, and it says that we perceive differences on a logarithmic rather than linear scale. It's not the amount of change, but rather the percent of change that matters. So, what are the biological processes involved in sensation, and how are sensations converted into perceptions? We'll try to answer these questions in the context of one of our most powerful senses, vision. Your eyes take in energy from light and transform that energy into neural messages that your brain processes and organizes into what you actually see. This process is called transduction. But how do we transform light waves into meaningful information? Light itself, what we humans see as light, is only a small fraction of the full spectrum of the electromagnetic radiation that ranges from gamma to radio waves. Light travels in waves. The wave's length and frequency determines the hue, that is, the color or shade that we see, and the wave's amplitude determines its brightness or value. Its purity, what we perceive as saturation or richness of color, is determined by the number of distinct wavelengths that make up the light. For instance, short waves with high frequency are registered by our eyes as bluish colors, while we see long, low-frequency wavelengths as reddish hues. It's the eye's lens that is responsible for focusing these incoming light waves onto the retina. But the lens must constantly change its shape so that the light is focused correctly. This change in the curvature of the lens is also based on the wavelength, with red light, the long low-frequency wavelengths, requiring the greatest curvature, and blue light, with its short, high-frequency waves, the least curvature. This means that if pure blue and pure red hues are intermixed, the lens is constantly changing shape and the eye actually becomes tired, as you can see from focusing on these circles for even a few seconds. In the case of text, the effect is even more pronounced, with blue or green text on a red background. Here again, two opposing wavelengths enter the lens, forcing it to either focus on one or the other. A related effect is called chromostereopsis, which is that pure colors located at the same distance from the eye appear to be at different distances. For example, reds appear closer and blues more distant. If you put violet next to yellow, or green next to orange, the violet and green retreat. In general, the warm colors such as red, orange, and yellow come forward, and the cool colors such as blue, green, and purple retreat. In this sense, the chromostereoptic effect gives shapes plasticity and allows for depth perception through simple color manipulation. Okay, so as we said, a color's hue is determined by the length and frequency of the light waves, but the brightness of a color is determined by the amplitude of those waves. The contrast between the red of an apple and the red of a fire truck is based on their amplitudes. That is, the amount of energy in a given light wave. Greater amplitude means higher intensity, means brighter color. So, the length and frequency of a light wave determines the hue, and the wave's amplitude determines intensity or brightness. At the same time, a color's saturation or purity depends on light complexity, the range of wavelengths in light. The color of a single wavelength is pure spectral color. Such lights are called fully saturated. Outside a laboratory, light is rarely pure or of a single wavelength. Light is usually a mixture of several different wavelengths. The greater number of spectral colors in a light, the lower the saturation. Light of mixed wavelengths looks duller or paler than pure light. When a light is reflected from the lens onto the retina, it is not by means of a full image. Instead, visual information is encoded as separate neural impulses from tiny portions of the world, so that eventually the brain can reconstruct in great detail fine visual differences from locations at which you're directly looking. The retina contains over 200 million photoreceptor cells called rods and cones. Rods give us sensitivity under dim lighting conditions and allow us to see at night. Cones allow us to see fine details in bright light and gives us the sensation of color. Cones are tightly packed around the fovea, the central region of the retina, and more sparsely elsewhere. Rods populate the periphery, the region surrounding the fovea, and are almost absent from the fovea. When stimulated, the rods and cones trigger chemical changes that spark neural signals, which in turn activate the cells behind them called bipolar cells, whose job it is to turn on the neighboring ganglion cells. The long axon tails of these ganglions braid together to form the ropey optic nerve, which is what carries the neural impulses from the eye to the brain. That information then slips through a chain of progressively complex levels as it travels from optic nerve to the thalamus and on to the brain's visual cortex. The visual cortex sits at the back of the brain in the occipital lobe, where the right cortex processes input from the left eye and the left cortex processes input from the right eye. What happens next? Well, you might think that the eye would do something like record the amount of light at each location in the world and then send this information to the visual processing areas of the brain. But, in fact, that is not what eyes do. As soon as photoreceptors capture light, the nervous system gets busy analyzing differences in light, and it is these differences that get transmitted to the brain. The brain, it turns out, cares little about the overall amount of light coming from a specific part of the world, or in the scene overall. Rather, it wants to know, does the light coming from this one point differ from the light coming from the point next to it? As a demonstration, place your hand on the table in front of you. The contour of your hand is actually determined by the difference in light, the contrast between the light coming from your skin in your hand and the light coming from the table underneath. To find the contour of your hand, we simply need to find the regions in the image where the difference in light between two adjacent points is maximal. 2 points on your skin will reflect similar levels of light back to you, as will 2 points on the table. On the other hand, 2 points that fall on either side of the boundary contour between your hand and the table will reflect very different light. We actually see objects by edge detection, where an edge can be created by a difference in color, brightness, or both. Edges formed by color differences alone with no brightness differences appear fuzzy and unfocused, so we need to add changes in brightness to get sharp edges. In addition to analyzing these differences in light, your visual cortex also has specialized nerve cells called feature detectors that respond to specific features like shape, angles, movements, and even faces. Some cells in a region may respond to just one type of stimulus like posture or movement or facial expression, while other clusters of cells weave all that separate information together in an instant analysis of the situation. This ability to process and analyze many separate aspects of the situation at once is called parallel processing. In the case of visual processing, this means that the brain simultaneously works on making sense of form, depth, motion, and color. It links together individual features into whole objects, allows us to recognize what those objects are, organizes objects into visual scenes, and detects motion and change in those scenes. Wow, that's a lot, huh? And that is where we need to begin to talk about the complicated and sometimes even ambiguous world of perception. Watch the image on your screen closely. Which of the two gray sections is darker? The top one or the bottom one? Try holding up your hands and blocking this section of the image. How can what appear to be two distinct shades of gray actually be the same color? This happens because your brain uses shadows to make decisions about what it's seeing. Take a look at this object. How do you know what it is and where it's positioned in space? Your visual cortex is first cross-referencing the information about this object with memories of past experiences stored throughout your brain. After identifying the object, your brain also has to determine how it is positioned in space. And one of its most reliable ways of doing this is to use shadows. Take a look at the basketball again. Now, let's add a shadow. Is it still moving in the same way? What if we change the position of the shadow? Now it looks as if the ball is rising and sinking. Let's tweak the shadow one more time. Now it appears as if the ball is bouncing. In this world, with a single natural light source, your brain has learned to trust shadows as a near foolproof way to know the behavior of objects in space. So what happened here? The gradient and shadow painted here have given your brain cues that the top is a well-lit gray surface and the bottom is a poorly lit light surface. Clues your brain trusts because of past experience with shadows. Other than using shadow to construct reality, what other perceptual tools do we have available to us? For one, retinal disparity, when viewing an object or scene, allows our left eye and right eye to view slightly different images. This binocular signal specifically provides information about distance. And yet, based on only two-dimensional images that fall on our retinas, we are still somehow able to see three-dimensional objects. Seeing objects in 3 dimensions, also known as depth perception, allows us to estimate distances between those objects and ourselves. Depth perception cues that don't require both eyes are called monocular cues. These include occlusion, relative size, relative height, texture gradient, familiar size, linear perspective, aerial perspective, and relative brightness. Let's consider each of these depth cues on this famous album cover of the Beatles. First, let's look for occlusion. This is the idea that an object that blocks the view of another object must be in front of it. So, when looking at the white Volkswagen and George Harrison, we know that George Harrison is in front of the Volkswagen because there is a portion of it that is being blocked by him. Relative size in this photo also suggests depth. This is the idea that smaller objects are further away, and it can be seen in the many cars in the image. Not all cars are the same size, but because the white Volkswagen is larger than all of the others, we can conclude that the other cars are progressively further away. Similarly, in texture gradient, as a texture gets further away, it forms smaller visual angles or pictures on the retina, and is less noticeable. If you look at the road at the bottom of the picture, the texture is made up of larger shapes compared to the texture of the road in the middle of the photo. In the middle, the texture is less obvious, suggesting it is further away. Relative height gives us the impression that objects that appear higher in our visual field are further away than objects that appear lower. Notice that the Beatles themselves are lower in the visual field and appear much closer than the trees, buildings, and cars that appear higher in our visual field. Familiar size is the idea that knowledge of the normal size of certain objects can provide cues to depth. For example, we are familiar with the size of people. In the picture, there is a man standing on the sidewalk. We know that this man is roughly the same size as the members of the Beatles because we have experience with the size of people. This clues us into the fact that the smaller looking man is probably just further away from the band members and is not actually a miniature person. Linear perspective, which is the idea that parallel lines seem to converge as they move into the distance, is also clear in this image. This cue can be seen when looking at the way the edges of the road converge. We know that the road isn't actually getting narrower, it's just getting further away. Aerial perspective is actually a far subtler depth cue in this picture. With aerial perspective, objects that are further away also appear to be hazier and bluer. This is somewhat true though for the trees and cars in the middle of the picture. Finally, relative brightness gives the impression that brighter images are closer and more shaded images are further away. Although John Lennon is probably directly in front of Ringo Starr, his bright white suit gives the impression that he is somewhat closer than the other members of the band. I should mention that like shadow and color, depth cues can also sometimes provide misinformation. Take a good look at this image known as the shepherd's table. Which table is thinner and longer, the one on the left or the one on the right? They are, in fact, exactly the same. But these vertical lines appear to recede far into the background, tricking your brain into seeing them as longer than these horizontal lines. Luckily, perceptual cues do not generally work in this kind of isolation. Instead, we combine information about shading and color and depth cues in an effort to build up an accurate perception. Perception is also guided by many organizational principles originally laid out by Gestalt psychologists. For example, we tend to group things together according to a principle of similarity, meaning that, all things being equal, we group together figures that resemble each other. So, here we tend to group these dots into columns rather than rows by grouping dots of similar colors. Form is also commonly perceived in the simplest way possible. For example, we would see this form as two intersecting rectangles rather than as a single 12-sided irregular polygon. We are also influenced by proximity. The closer figures are to each other, the more we tend to group them together perceptually. Here, we perceive three groups, linking the dots that are closer together and separating the dots that are farther apart. Perceptual organization is also guided by the principle of good continuation, a preference for organizing form in a way where contours continue smoothly along their original course. For example, we tend to see a continuous green bar rather than two smaller rectangles. In another example, this looks like this, not like this. We're also absolute masters of perceiving closure in the presence of incomplete information. As you can see in this image, though the edges of the circle are not defined entirely, our minds continue the edges and it appears to be a white circle surrounded by spikes of various sizes. Some theorists actually interpret these subjective contours as a special case of good continuation. In their view, the contour is seen to continue along its original path. In either case, human perceivers seem to have a very strong tendency to impose completeness on small amounts of input. Our brain unconsciously works to construct meaning and patterns even in the absence of either. For instance, we often see images in clouds or rock formations. This tendency to organize incomplete and even random images into meaningful images is called pareidolia. An amazing graphic artist, Christoph Niemann, who is a master at creating fun and compelling images, has taken pareidolia in a particularly charming direction. He uses art to make meaning and whimsy out of everyday objects. Here are just a few. It's not a coincidence that pareidolia predominantly affects the perception of animate figures like animals, human bodies, and human or human-like faces. This shows the strength of these templates in our visual memory and the strong significance of seeing these objects in our environments. In fact, there is ample evidence that our tendency towards closure, that is, filling in information to complete perceptions, is particularly powerful in the context of seeing human form, particularly faces. In this way, surprisingly incomplete images are built by our brains into rich and complete images. Now let's look at closure in the context of movement. Take a look at these dots. Hopefully, you can make out the outlines of two people, but can you tell what they're doing? If you said arguing, you're right. Try these. How many did you get right? How is your brain able to recognize complex action from a rudimentary set of dots so easily? Perceptual closure, along with the fact that we are hardwired to recognize biological motion, again help to explain these impressive skills. Have these Gestalt principles impressed you? I hope so! Truly an endless number of examples of our brain's tendency towards simplicity, coherence, and wholeness. As a final topic, I will describe one particularly vigorous debate in the field of perception that came to inspire countless experimental studies across centuries. The debate centered around the question of whether perception of the world is a set of innate abilities or instead a set of acquired or learned skills. These opposing views have been termed nativism and empiricism, also known as bottom-up versus top-down processing. It was psychologist Richard Gregory who first argued that perception is a constructive process which relies on top-down processing. Stimulus information from an environment is frequently ambiguous, so to interpret it, we require higher cognitive information either from past experience or stored information in order to make inferences about what we perceive. For Gregory, perception is a hypothesis, which is based on our prior knowledge. In this way, we are actively constructing our perception of reality based on our environment and stored information. For example, understanding difficult handwriting is easier when reading complete sentences than when reading single and isolated words. This is because the meaning of the surrounding words provides a context to aid understanding. Read the following quote out loud. Notice anything odd while you were reading the text in the triangle? Did you notice the second "the"? If not, it's likely because you were reading this with a top-down processing approach. Having a second "the" doesn't make sense. Our brain knows this and it doesn't expect there to be a second one, so we have a tendency to skip right over it. Your past experience has changed the way you perceive the writing in the triangle. A beginning reader, one who is using a bottom-up approach by carefully attending to each piece, would be less likely to make this error. Gregory argued perception involves a lot of constant unconscious hypothesis testing to make meaning of the information presented to our senses, and there are several types of evidence that seem to support this idea of how perceptions are created. First, highly unlikely objects tend to be mistaken for likely objects. Gregory famously demonstrated this with a hollow mask of a face. Such a mask is generally seen as normal. Even when you know and can feel the real mask, there seems to be an overwhelming need to reconstruct the face based on past experience. We also see objects as whole and complete even when parts of them are obscured. For example, a person walking toward us carrying, let's say, a tuba, does not look fractured, a top, a bottom, and a gap in the middle, caused by the tuba. We see the whole person, but the outline of the person is incomplete as it is in this example. Gregory would argue that we must be using knowledge of people, that is, they can't be in parts, to go beyond the sensory evidence delivered from this visual image. Additional evidence for this top-down view is supported by ambiguous figures. During continued observation of an ambiguous figure, sudden perceptual reversals occur, while the stimulus itself stays unchanged. A good example is the Necker cube. When you stare at the crosses on the cube, the orientation can suddenly change or flip. It becomes unstable and again shows that a single sensory pattern can produce two perceptions. If you are a proponent of top-down processing, you might say that this object appears to flip between orientations because the brain develops two equally plausible hypotheses and is unable to decide between them. When the perception changes, though there is no change of sensory input, the change of appearance cannot be due to only the static pattern that we're sensing. It must be built top-down by our current prevailing perceptual hypotheses of what is near and what is far. In other words, if one physical display can induce two different perceptions, then this is an example of when perception cannot be tied directly to stimulation alone. There is also, however, evidence to refute a top-down hypothesis testing view of perception. First, if perceptions make use of hypothesis testing, the question can be asked, what kind of hypotheses are they? Are we, as perceivers, also able to modify our hypotheses? In some cases, it would seem the answer is yes. For example, this probably looks like a random arrangement of black shapes. In fact, there's a hidden figure in there. Can you see it? What if I had shown you this first? Now can you see it? Once the dog is discovered, very rapid perceptual learning takes place and the ambiguous picture now obviously contains a dog each time we look at it. While this is arguably a very good example of a direct relationship between modifying hypotheses and perception, in other cases this process is not evident. For example, illusions persist even when we have full knowledge of them. Remember the gray squares and inverted face? One would expect that the knowledge we have gained from covering the center line between the squares or touching the mask would modify our hypotheses, but in this case, learning does not change our perception. Another perplexing question for the empiricists who propose perception is essentially top-down is, how can newborns ever perceive? In fact, newborn infants, as soon as 5 minutes after birth, already show a preference for normal facial features rather than scrambled features. Infants also show shape constancy. That is, the ability to perceive the shape of a rigid object as constant despite differences in the viewing angle. Taken together, this evidence has been put forward in support of a nativist or bottom-up view of perception, in which nothing more is needed beyond the stimulus set within the rich visual context of the world around us. First articulated by James Gibson, bottom-up processing suggests that perception involves innate mechanisms forged by evolution, and that no learning is required. Gibson argued that perception is direct, and not subject to hypothesis testing as Gregory had proposed. There is enough information in our environment to make sense of the world in a direct way. For Gibson, sensation is perception. What you see is what you get. There's no need for processing or interpretation, as the information we receive about size, shape, distance, etc. is sufficiently detailed for us to interact directly with the environment. Put simply, he proposed that this is possible due to something called affordances. Affordances for humans include such things as surfaces that are stand-onable or sit-onable, objects that are graspable or throwable, objects that afford hitting, substances that afford pouring. In short, affordances are meanings that an environment has. As meanings, they guide behavior, telling the observer what is and what is not possible. Gibson would say that there has in fact been learning in the perception of affordances, but that this has taken place over the course of millions of years of evolutionary history, not the course of particular lifetimes. He believes that individual learning is only involved in terms of figuring out which affordances to attend to. Neither top-down or bottom-up theories of perception on their own seem capable of explaining all perception all of the time. Perceptual research over the last several decades has in fact shown convincing evidence for both types of processing. Top-down and bottom-up processes are interacting with each other to produce the best interpretation of the world around us.